All right, today we're going to take a trip back in time, way back. We're heading to the Middle Ages to get our heads around a system that basically ran everything for centuries. It's called feudalism.
But first, I want you to imagine something. What if your job, where you lived, who you had to obey, what if all of that was completely locked in the second you were born? Seriously, no changes allowed. Well, for millions of people, that wasn't a what if. It was just life. So, what exactly was this feudal system? You can think of it as a giant society-wide deal. See, the Middle Ages could be a pretty chaotic and dangerous time. So the core idea was this. You get land to live on and an army to protect you, and in return, you provide your work and your absolute loyalty. Simple, right? Now, the best way to really picture this whole society is to think of a giant pyramid. Everyone had a specific layer they belonged to, and everyone knew their place. It was this rigid structure that kept everything, well, structured. And here are those layers. Right at the very tip top, you've got the king. Just below him are the powerful lords and nobles. These were the big-time landowners. Then you have the knights, the professional warriors of the age, and holding the whole thing up, the massive base of the entire pyramid, were the serfs. So let's start at the top and work our way down. What was life really like for the people in charge? What did it actually mean to be a king, a lord, or a knight back then? The king was the ultimate boss. On paper, he owned every square inch of land in the entire kingdom. But his power wasn't just about owning stuff. See, everyone believed the king was chosen to rule by God himself. This idea was called divine right, and it meant that going against the king was like going against God. Pretty powerful stuff. Now, this is where you can really see how it all fit together. It was a chain of promises. The king gives huge chunks of land to his lords. In return, they owe him loyalty, tax money, and soldiers for his armies. The lords then turn around and give smaller pieces of that land to knights. The knight's job? To fight for that lord whenever he calls. It all flowed downwards, all based on land and loyalty. You know, being a knight wasn't just about swinging a sword. They were expected to follow a strict moral code called chivalry. This was a whole set of rules about being brave in a fight, yes, but also about being loyal to your lord and treating people with honor. It was the ideal of what a warrior should be. Okay, we've seen life at the top of the pyramid. Now let's go all the way to the bottom. We're going to talk about the foundation, the group of people whose hard work made everything else possible. The serfs. It is almost impossible to overstate just how essential the serfs were. I mean, they were the overwhelming majority of people. We're talking something like 90% of the population. And their job was simple, to work the land. Without their constant backbreaking labor, the entire feudal pyramid would have just crumbled. They literally fed everyone. Now, this is a really, really important distinction to make. A serf was not the same thing as a slave. A slave was legally considered property. They could be bought and sold like an animal. A serf, however, was tied to the land. You couldn't sell a serf. If a lord took over a new piece of land, the serfs living there just came with it. They were part of the property, not property themselves. So what was life actually like for a serf? Well, it was tough. You're basically stuck on your lord's estate, called a manor. You couldn't just decide to move to the next town. You needed permission, and you almost never got it. Your days were filled with the long, grueling hours of farming. But, and this is a big but, in return for all that work, you got protection. In a very dangerous world, that was a huge deal. The Lord's knights were there to keep you and your family safe. So you have this huge, complicated system that lasted for hundreds of years. What held it all together? What was the glue? Well, it really boiled down to three main things: land, loyalty, and faith. Let's start with land. In the Middle Ages, land was everything. It was power, it was wealth, it was food. The technical term for a piece of land granted by a lord was a fief. And this is the key part. It was a loan, not a gift. As long as you kept your promise, whether that was fighting or governing, you could use the land. If you broke your promise, you could lose it. The second part of the glue was that personal promise. It was called an oath of fealty. This was a super serious public ceremony where a person, called a vassal, would swear to be loyal to their lord for life. This bond was considered sacred. Breaking it wasn't just a mistake, it was treason, one of the absolute worst crimes you could commit. And that brings us to the third, and maybe the most powerful piece of glue: faith. The church was incredibly influential. And it taught that this whole pyramid structure wasn't just some human idea. No, it was God's divine plan. The king was on top because God put him there, and serfs were on the bottom for the exact same reason. Who was going to argue with God's plan?
But as we know, things change. Nothing lasts forever. After dominating Europe for centuries, this incredibly rigid system started to crack, and eventually, the whole pyramid came crumbling down. So, what happened?
Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was a slow burn of massive changes. First, towns and cities started growing, creating new jobs and opportunities outside the old system. Then, the Black Death, a horrific plague, wiped out a huge part of the population, which suddenly made workers very scarce and valuable. At the same time, new weapons, like the longbow, could pierce a knight's armor, making them less dominant on the battlefield. And finally, kings started to raise enough money to hire their own armies, so they didn't need their lord's knights anymore. You see how all these things connected? Serfs could now run away to a city and start a new life. The ones who stayed behind could demand better pay and more rights because their lords desperately needed them. The all-powerful knight wasn't so all-powerful anymore, and kings were becoming more independent. The old bonds, the glue that held the pyramid together, were just dissolving. Again, this didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, messy process that took hundreds of years. But bit by bit, the strict layers of that old feudal pyramid began to fade away, and a new, more modern kind of society started to emerge in its place. And that kind of leaves us with a pretty big question to chew on, doesn't it? The whole feudal system was built on a trade-off. You gave up your personal freedom in exchange for security. It makes you stop and think, what's the trade-off today? What do we as a society value more, freedom or security? And what does our answer say about the world we're building right now?